Hello, welcome to the Heartbreak Stories channel. Today's story is about a man who spent years being quietly underestimated by the one person who should have known better. What happens when a woman mistakes her husband's silence for weakness and he decides to stop being silent?
She bragged to her friends that she kept me in line. I let her believe it, right up until I quietly removed everything she thought she owned. 3 days later, her lawyer called her, panicked. She'd just learned the truth about the man she spent 11 years underestimating. My name is Elliot Harwick. I'm 62 years old, and for the past 11 years I've been married to Nadine Harwick. Nay Stokes, age 50, who runs a small art foundation here in Asheville, North Carolina. She likes to call herself a cultural curator. I call her the woman who turned my silence into a leash. I own commercial property. Nothing glamorous. A strip of retail units on the east side of town, 2 small office buildings near the airport, and a warehouse I lease to a logistics company on a long-term contract. It's not exciting work. It's paperwork and maintenance calls and reading contracts at the kitchen table, while Nadine is somewhere across the house making the kind of phone calls that run too long and drop too low to hear clearly. That last part matters, because it was one of those calls that started all of this. It was a Tuesday evening in early October. The light outside had gone amber, the kind that makes even ordinary things look expensive. I'd come in from checking on a tenant issue at the Merrifield units and was walking through the hallway toward the kitchen when I heard her voice drifting from a sunroom. She had that Bluetooth piece in her ear, the one she wore like a badge of importance, and the French doors were pulled halfway shut. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was just walking through my own house. "He's not going anywhere," she said and laughed. Not a warm laugh, the kind that curls at the edges. I know exactly what keeps him in line. He's too proud to fight it and too smart to call my bluff. I stopped. My hand was still on the hallway wall. She went on, her voice lower now, but still audible. "Dorian, you don't understand. Elliot has history, old history, and I'm the only one in this town who knows how to frame it." I stood there for a moment, maybe 10 seconds, maybe 30, and then I walked the rest of the way to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stood at the sink staring at the backyard. Dorian Vale. I knew the name. He'd come around a few times as part of Nadine's foundation circle. Tall, soft-spoken, the kind of man who stood too close when he talked to women and called it warmth. He'd once asked me, casually, about commercial lease structures. Said he was thinking of opening a small gallery space. I'd given him 40 minutes of solid advice, free of charge. Apparently, that transaction had gone in a different direction than I realized. I didn't walk back into that sunroom. I didn't raise my voice. I finished my water, rinsed the glass, and went upstairs to the study, the room Nadine called cluttered and I called mine. Inside, on the bottom shelf behind a row of tax binders, sat a manila envelope I hadn't opened in over 2 decades. I sat down and held it in both hands. Inside was a letter from Federal Oversight Office, dated 1999. During a commercial real estate dispute involving a government-adjacent development project, a competitor had filed a misconduct complaint against me. Bid manipulation, falsified appraisals. The works. It went nowhere because none of it was true. The investigation closed in 4 months. I was cleared completely. The letter said so in plain language. I never talked about it publicly because I didn't see the point. The matter was resolved. I moved on. But somewhere along the way, Nadine had found out about the investigation. And somewhere between finding out and tonight, she had quietly turned it into a weapon. I set the envelope on the desk and leaned back in the chair. Outside, I could hear her laughing again, that same sound, easy and careless, like a woman who believed her foundation was solid. She thought she was holding the rope. What she didn't know was that I'd been the one who built the knot. I reached for my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't used in 3 years. Kenneth Crane, attorney, the kind of man who answers on the second ring and never wastes a word. It rang once. Then, "Elliot, been a while." "It has," I replied. "I need to meet. Soon." A pause, brief, professional. "Tomorrow morning. My office. 8 o'clock." I set the phone down, looked at the envelope again, and felt something settle inside my chest. Not anger, not grief. Something colder and more useful than either. The game had already started. She just didn't know I'd been holding cards the whole time. Ken Crane's office was on the fourth floor of a building downtown that smelled like old wood and serious money. No artwork on the walls, no plants on the windowsill. Just law books, a clean desk, and a man who looked like he'd been born wearing a suit. I laid the envelope in front of him without a word. He read the clearance letter twice. Then he set it down, folded his hands, and looked at me the way a doctor looks at an X-ray before delivering news. Who else knows this exists? Ken asked. Nobody, I told him. Not even my brother. He tapped the edge of the letter once. And she's been using the investigation, not the clearance, as leverage. That's my read, I replied. She tells people I had trouble. Lets them fill in the blanks. He leaned back. How wide is the damage? I told him about the phone call, about Dorian Vale, and then I told him about my neighbor Phil Garrett, retired contractor, good man, terrible poker face, who'd stopped me in the driveway 2 days before I called Ken. Phil had given me that look, the one people use when they're about to say something they think might hurt you, but can't help saying anyway. Hey, Elliot, he'd started, shifting his weight. I don't want to get in your business, but Nadine mentioned something at the Hard Rose cookout last month. Something about a government investigation. Said you'd been through a rough patch years back, and that she'd help you keep it together. He paused. I figured you'd want to know it was making the rounds. I'd thanked him and said it was old news, nothing to it. Walking back inside, I hadn't felt angry. I'd felt something click into place, the quiet, certain feeling of a man who finally understands the shape of the problem. Can listen to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, then said flatly, she's been running a narrative. Deliberate, sustained, socially distributed. That's not pillow talk. That's a campaign. I know. And Dorian Vale. Ken picked up his pen. What's his connection to your property dealings? That was the part that still sat sideways in my gut. 2 years ago, Vale had approached me about leasing one of my Merrifield units for a gallery venture. We'd talked for nearly an hour. I'd walked him through lease structures, deposit terms, build-out allowances. He'd never signed anything. Said he needed more time. I'd thought nothing of it. He used me, I said. Got what he needed and walked. Ken wrote something down. Used your professional knowledge. And now he's the one your wife calls when she wants to feel understood. He looked up. That's not a coincidence, Elliot. That's a pattern. We talked for another hour. By the end of it, Ken had a plan sketched out, careful, measured, nothing premature. First step, document everything. Dates, names, what was said and where. Second step, a quiet audit of every joint financial instrument Nadine had access to. Third step, wait. Don't tip her off, he said as I stood to leave. Let her keep talking. Every word she says out there is evidence. I drove home slowly, taking the long way around the lake. October in Asheville had turned everything copper and rust. The kind of beauty that looks better when you're not carrying weight. I was carrying weight. When I pulled into the driveway, Nadine was outside by the mailbox in a cream-colored coat, phone pressed to her ear. She gave me a small wave and turned slightly away. Just enough to signal the call was private. I waved back, smiled, went inside. In the study, I pulled out a legal pad and started writing. Names, dates, what Phil had said, what Nadine had said in that sunroom, what I knew about Dorian Vale. The more I wrote, the more I understood that this hadn't started last Tuesday. This had been building for years. Quiet, incremental, the way water finds the low spots in a foundation. The phone rang around 7. I didn't recognize the number, so I answered. Mr. Harwick? A man's voice, cautious and slightly formal. My name is Boyd Stokes. I think you know who I am. I did. He was Nadine's first husband, the one she described as volatile and reckless. The cautionary tale she trotted out to explain why she needed to start over. I know who you are, I replied, keeping my voice even. I won't waste your time, Boyd said. I heard through someone that things might be shifting in your household. And I thought you might want to hear a few things from someone who's been where you're standing. He exhaled. She didn't leave me because I was difficult, Mr. Harwick. She left because she'd already decided I wasn't useful anymore. And before she left, she spent 8 months telling everyone I had problems I didn't have. The legal pad was still open in front of me. I picked up the pen. I'm listening, I told him. Outside, the last of the October light faded behind a ridge. Nadine was still on her call. I could see the pale glow of her phone screen through the window, moving slowly across the yard like a lantern in a very small dark. She thought she was the one running this. She hadn't looked up long enough to notice I'd already started moving. Boyd Stokes talked for 40 minutes. I didn't interrupt once. He'd met Nadine at a fundraiser in Raleigh 20 years ago. She was charming, focused, the kind of woman who made you feel like you were the only person in the room. They married fast, too fast, he said, with the calm tone of a man who'd made peace with a bad decision. Within 2 years, she'd positioned herself as the competent one, the stable one, the one holding everything together while Boyd supposedly stumbled from one mistake to the next. Except he hadn't stumbled. He'd been pushed. She told people I had a drinking problem, Boyd said. I had maybe 2 glasses of wine a week. She told people I mishandled our joint finances. I had receipts for every transaction. She constructed a version of me that made her look indispensable. He paused. Sound familiar? It did. Word for word. She needs to be the rescuer, he continued. It's not enough to be loved. She needs to be necessary. And if you're not in trouble, she'll manufacture the trouble. I thanked him, asked if he'd be willing to put anything in writing if it came to that. He said yes without hesitating. We agreed to stay in touch. I called Ken the next morning and relayed the conversation. He was quiet for a moment, then said, We now have a pattern. That's different from a grievance. That's a case. That same week, I made a move I'd been thinking about since the night at the sink. Nadine monitored our joint account the way some people monitor the weather, casually, confidently, assuming it would behave the way it always had. I deposited regularly for years. She spent without consulting me, which I'd tolerated because the amounts were manageable and the peace was worth it. But now I needed her to stop looking. I left 3 things visible on the kitchen counter one morning before she came downstairs. A printed bank statement showing the joint account balance considerably lower than usual, a handwritten note that said called the property manager Merrifield vacancy issue, and a folder labeled Q3 shortfall. Review needed. None of it was fabricated. The Merrifield unit did have a vacancy. Q3 had been slower. I just arranged the truth to tell a particular story. Then I went to work. By the time Nadine came downstairs and scanned the counter, I watched from the hallway, reflected faintly in the kitchen window. She picked up the statement, looked at it, set it back down, and said nothing. Just refilled her coffee and went to her office. Good. That afternoon, I met with Ken and finalized the transfer of my primary rental income stream into a property management LLC I'd set up 2 years ago for liability protection. Nadine had signed the initial paperwork. She'd been in a hurry, some foundation event. She'd skimmed 2 pages and written her name in 3 places. The structure gave the LLC full operational control. Her name wasn't on the operating agreement. It never had been. Ken reviewed everything and looked up. She has no claim to the LLC income. The joint account is the only thread she's holding, and you've already started pulling it. I want to do this right, I told him. Nothing that looks retaliatory. It won't, he replied. It'll look exactly like what it is. A man protecting assets he built before, during and after a marriage to someone who was never his partner. Just his audience. I drove home that evening feeling lighter than I had in years. Not happy, not yet, but clear. The kind of clear you get when you stop pretending a problem doesn't exist and start treating it like the engineering challenge it actually is. Nadine was out at a foundation board dinner. The house was quiet. I went upstairs, called my son Nolan, and told him to come to Asheville that weekend. He didn't ask why. He just said, "About time, Dad. I'll be there Saturday morning." Nolan was 34, an architect based in Durham, and the best decision I'd made in my first marriage. Nadine had kept him at arm's length from day one. Too much shared history, too much loyalty to a version of me she hadn't curated. I'd let her manage the distance, because I believed it was just personality friction. Boyd Stokes had helped me understand what it actually was. Saturday came. Nolan arrived with coffee and no small talk. We sat in the study, and I told him everything. The phone call, the clearance letter, Ken, Boyd. He listened the way he always had, still focused, processing. When I finished, he leaned forward. "The trust," he said. "Is it still structured the way you set it up before you remarried?" It is I told him. Your name is still the primary beneficiary. Nothing changed. He nodded slowly. She doesn't know that, does she? It wasn't a question. I answered it anyway. She thinks the house and the rental income are the whole picture, I said. She's never once asked about the trust. Nolan looked at the envelope on the desk, the clearance letter still sitting where I'd left it, and then looked back at me with his mother's eyes and my father's jaw. Then let her keep thinking that, he said quietly, until it's too late to matter. The weekend Nolan came to Asheville, we didn't just talk strategy. Saturday afternoon, we drove out to the Merrifield Strip to walk the vacant unit. I wanted his eye on it. He had a good sense for space, for what a build-out would cost versus what a tenant would realistically commit to. We talked square footage and HVAC and lease terms the way we always had, easy and specific, two people who understood each other without needing to explain the background. Nadine had called it boring once. Said she couldn't understand how I found property management interesting. What she didn't understand was that it wasn't the properties that interested me. It was the structure, the permanence, the satisfaction of something built to last. Over dinner that evening, Nolan set down his fork and looked at me directly. She called me, he said, about 8 months ago. Nadine. I kept my expression steady. What did she say? She said you were going through a stressful period, that you weren't sleeping well, that you'd become withdrawn, that you'd told her you needed space from. And I'm quoting her, outside noise. He picked up his fork again. She suggested I give you some room for a while. I looked at my plate. 8 months. I thought the distance between us had just been the natural drift of busy lives. Nolan in Durham, me in Asheville, both of us absorbed in work. Did it seem strange to you? I asked. Immediately, he replied. You've never once in your life asked for space from me. But she said it so smoothly, like she was doing me a favor by passing along your wishes. He paused. I should have called you directly. She's good at framing, I said. She's calculated, he corrected. There's a difference. He was right. Framing could be instinct. What Nadine did was deliberate. A careful management of information, distributed to the right people at the right time to produce the desired result. She hadn't just kept Nolan at a distance. She'd made him believe it was my idea. After dinner, I called Ken and updated him. He added it to what he was already calling the pattern file. This keeps building, he noted. Isolation of family members is significant. Document the conversation with your son. Dates, exact wording, everything. Sunday morning, Nolan left early. Before he got in the car, he gripped my shoulder and said, "Whatever you need, Dad. Whatever comes next. I'm not going anywhere." I watched him drive out and stood in the driveway for a moment, hands in my jacket pockets, the October air cold against my face. Then I went back inside and did something I've been sitting on for 10 days. I called Boyd Stokes. You mentioned she told people you mishandled your finances, I said. Did she ever forge anything? Sign your name to something you didn't authorize? Silence on the other end. Then, carefully, there was one thing. A transfer authorization from our joint investment account. I found it 2 years after the divorce. My signature, but I never signed it. Another pause. My attorney at the time said it wasn't worth pursuing. The amount wasn't large enough. I wrote it down. It might be worth mentioning now. You think she's done again? I think it's worth checking. After the call, I walked to the filing cabinet in the corner of the study and pulled the folder Ken had flagged, the LLC formation documents Nadine had signed. I went through every page slowly, checking the signature lines against other documents I knew she'd handled. On page 7, there was a notary acknowledgement. The initials in the margin weren't Nadine's. They were close, same general shape, but the loop on the end was wrong. I photographed it with my phone, sent it to Ken with one line. Check the initials on page 7 of the LLC docs. His response came 20 minutes later. Already flagged it. Good eyes. Don't touch anything. I set the phone down and looked out the study window at the backyard. Nadine's car was in the drive. She'd come home while I was on the phone, and now I could see the kitchen light was on. She was probably making tea, scrolling through her phone, entirely at ease in a house she believed she understood completely. 2 days later, Ken called with confirmation. The initials on page 7 didn't match Nadine's signature on file. A handwriting analyst would be needed to formalize it, but the preliminary read was clear. She hadn't just leveraged a lie. She'd falsified a legal document. The rope she thought she was holding just became the thing that would bind her. Ken had a contact at a title records office who owed him a favor. 3 days after I sent the photograph of page 7, Ken called me at 7 in the morning, earlier than he ever called. The initials aren't hers, he said without preamble. Handwriting analysts confirmed it overnight. Whoever initialed that page was approximating her signature, not producing it naturally. The pressure patterns are wrong. The angle on the end is consistent across 3 other letters in the document, but not with any of Nadine's verified samples. He paused. We have falsification of a legal document, Elliot. That's not a divorce argument. That's a crime. I sat with that for a moment. What do we do with it? Nothing yet, Ken replied. We hold it. When the time comes, her attorney is going to walk into a room thinking this is a contested asset dispute. We're going to hand him something else entirely. That same afternoon, Boyd Stokes drove up from Raleigh. I'd suggested we meet in person rather than over the phone. He agreed without hesitation. We sat in the study, the same room where this whole thing had begun, and he walked me through the transfer authorization he'd discovered 2 years after his divorce from Nadine. It was $4,000, he said, from our joint investment account into a personal account she'd opened 6 months before she filed. He set a folder on the desk, copies of the original documents, his own records. My attorney said the amount wasn't worth the fight, but I kept everything. I looked through the pages carefully. The signature on the authorization form was Boyd's, or a version of it. The loop on the lowercase d was slightly too wide. The date stamp was from a Thursday afternoon when Boyd had been, by his own records, supervising a job site in Durham. You were out of town when this was signed, I said. 3 hours away, he confirmed. I have the project receipts. I photographed his documents with his permission and sent them to Ken immediately. The pattern was now documented across 2 marriages. 2 different men. Same method. Ken's message came back within the hour. This is exactly what we needed. Don't let him leave town. After Boyd left, I stood at the study window for a long time. The November sky had gone flat and gray, the kind of afternoon that makes you aware of every quiet thing. Down the hall, Nadine's office door was closed. I could hear the faint sound of music playing, something soft and ambient, the kind she put on when she was working on grant proposals. She was in there building her public image while I was in here documenting the architecture of her private one. I went back to my desk and pulled up the donor directory for the Asheville Arts Community, a PDF I'd downloaded from a local nonprofit coalition site. I scrolled through until I found a name I was looking for. Raymond Chu, retired professor, arts advocate, independent gallery owner. Nadine had frozen him out of the foundation grant cycle 2 years ago. I'd heard the story from 3 different people, all of whom described it the same way. Nadine had decided Raymond's project didn't fit the foundation's evolving curatorial vision. Raymond had taken it quietly and moved on. I'd met Raymond once at a civic dinner. He was sharp, principled, and had spent 15 years building a small gallery that showed emerging local artists without charging them commissions. The kind of work that didn't generate headlines but mattered to the people it served. I picked up the phone and called him. He answered on the 3rd ring, cautious at first, then more open when I explained what I had in mind. I told him I wanted to sponsor an upcoming show. Quietly, no fanfare, just a check that covered his spring programming costs. He was silent for a moment. Why now, he asked. Because your work deserves support, I told him, and because I should have done this 2 years ago instead of staying out of foundation politics. Another pause. Then, I appreciate that, Mr. Harwick. More than you know. We agreed on an amount, and I sent it through that evening. No press release. No announcement. Just a transfer and a handshake over the phone. Word would travel. In the Asheville arts community, it always did. And when it reached Nadine's ears, that her husband had quietly backed the man she'd publicly sidelined. The message would be clear without a single word being addressed to her directly. I was not the man she'd been describing. That evening, Nadine came to the kitchen doorway while I was making dinner and watched me for a moment. Raymond Chu called me today, she said. Her voice was measured, trying to read the room. I kept my eyes on the pan. Did he? He mentioned a sponsorship. A beat. From you. The man does good work, I replied evenly. Seemed like the right thing. She stood there a moment longer, recalibrating. Then she said, "I didn't know you were interested in that side of the arts community." I turned and looked at her directly. "There's quite a bit you don't know about me, Nadine." She held my gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then turned and went back to her office. I went back to cooking, calm, unhurried. The pan was steady in my hand. It happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into November. I was at the Merrifield units doing a walkthrough with a prospective tenant when the pressure started. Not pain exactly, more like a weight settling across my chest, spreading into my left shoulder. I recognized it immediately. I'd had a minor cardiac episode 7 years ago, pre-Nadine, and my cardiologist had been clear about the signals. I told the tenant we'd need to reschedule, walked to my truck, and drove myself to Mission Hospital on the east side. Kept both hands on the wheel, focused on breathing, no music. The kind of drive where every stoplight feels like a negotiation. By the time I reached the ER, the pressure had eased slightly, but they admitted me anyway. EKG, blood draw, monitoring. The attending physician was a composed woman named Dr. Reese who asked me the standard questions and then told me to rest and let the tests run. Nolan arrived within 2 hours. He'd been in Asheville for a client meeting and got my text before I'd even been moved to a room. He sat in the chair beside the bed, jacket still on, and didn't say anything sentimental. Just put his hand briefly on my arm and said, "You drove yourself?" The alternative was lying on the floor of a vacant retail unit. I told him. He almost smiled. Nadine arrived 40 minutes after Nolan. She came through the door with the right expression, concern arranged carefully on her face, hand going to my arm, the appropriate words delivered in the appropriate order. But something was off in the sequence, the way an actor hits the right notes, but in the wrong rhythm. She pulled one of the nurses aside in the hallway. I could see her through the glass partition, couldn't hear the words, but could read the posture. The nurse was answering questions, and Nadine was nodding, her phone in her hand, typing something as the nurse spoke. After Nadine stepped away, the nurse, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s named Carol, came back into the room to check my monitor. She caught my eyes and held them for a moment. Something in her expression had shifted. "Your wife had some questions," Carol said, adjusting the monitor lead with practiced efficiency. "What kind of questions?" I asked quietly. She glanced toward the hallway, then back at me. "About your insurance coverage, and about what typically happens with estate decisions when a patient has a cardiac event." She kept her voice professionally flat. "I've been doing this job for 22 years, Mr. Harwick. People ask about that stuff, but usually they ask the attending, and usually they wait until the patient is stable." A pause. "She asked before she came in to see you."
Before she even walked through that door, she was already asking about the insurance and the estate. That's not a scared wife. That's a woman who's been waiting for an opportunity.
Nolan, who had said nothing, looked up from his phone. I held Carol's gaze. "Thank you for telling me." She gave a small nod, made a note on her tablet, and left. The room was quiet for a moment. Nolan set his phone face down on the chair arm. "Dad," he said. I heard her. I told him. The test came back clean. No cardiac event. Elevated stress markers, a warning to slow down and follow up with my cardiologist. Dr. Reese discharged me the following morning with a list of instructions and a referral. Nadine drove me home. She was attentive, solicitous, made tea when we got in, asked twice if I needed anything. All the right moves. I accepted them without comment. That afternoon, while she was on a call, I went to the study and called Ken. She asked about estate decisions before she came into the room. I told him. A long pause. "Elliot, that changes our timeline. We need to move faster." "How much faster?" "I want everything documented and filed by end of next week," he replied. "The LLC transfer, the handwriting analysis, Boyd's records, all of it. I want it in a formal package before she makes another move." His voice was steady but firm. "You're not just protecting assets anymore. You're protecting yourself." I hung up and sat in the study with the door closed, the clearance letter on the desk in front of me, the winter light coming flat through the window. I thought about Carol, about the way she'd looked at me, not with pity, but with a clear-eyed recognition of someone who'd seen this particular performance before. I hadn't needed a hospital visit to confirm what I already knew. But sometimes the truth shows itself in ways you weren't expecting and in places you'd rather not be. The question now wasn't what Nadine was capable of. I already knew that. The question was how quickly Ken and I could finish what we'd started. Ken filed everything on a Thursday. The LLC transfer, the handwriting analysis, Boyd's records, the comparative signature review, Carol's written account. All of it organized into a formal legal package and submitted to the appropriate channels before Nadine had finished her morning coffee. I wasn't there for the filing. I was at the Merrifield units replacing a broken exterior light with a tenant who'd been patient about it for 2 weeks. Ordinary work. Steady hands. The kind of morning that doesn't announce itself. Ken called me at 11:15. "It's done," he said. "Everything is on record. If Forsyth calls you directly, say nothing. Refer him to me." "Understood," I replied. "One more thing." A pause. "I sent a courtesy notice to Gerald Forsyth this morning. Standard language. Formal notification that you have retained counsel and that all communication should be directed accordingly. No details. No accusations. Just a signal that the landscape has changed." I understood what that signal would produce. Forsyth would go to Nadine. Nadine would ask what it meant. And Forsyth, being a thorough attorney, would start pulling threads, which meant he'd eventually pull the thread that led to the clearance letter, the handwriting analysis, and Boyd Stokes. That process took 4 days. The call came on a Monday, not from Forsyth directly, from Nadine's cell phone, which surprised me. I let it ring through to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. 20 minutes later, Forsyth called Ken. Ken relayed the conversation to me that evening, word for word, the way he always did, precise, without editorializing. Forsyth had started with the standard framing. His client had concerns about the asset restructuring, questions about the LLC documentation, a desire to understand the timeline of transfers. Routine opening moves. Then, Ken had sent him the package. The silence on Forsyth's end, Ken told me, lasted nearly 8 seconds. Then, carefully, "Where did this handwriting analysis come from?" "A certified forensic examiner," Ken replied. "The report is on page 11. Another pause. "And the second set of documents, the records from a previous marriage?" "Page 19, with accompanying travel records and dated receipts." Forsyth's voice, Ken said, had shifted somewhere in the middle of that exchange. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. The way a man's voice shifts when he realizes he's been handed a case he didn't sign up for. "She's just learned the truth about you," Forsyth finally said, almost to himself, not as an accusation, but as the flat acknowledgement of a man recalibrating. "She said you were the one with history. She never mentioned. She had the clearance letter for 4 years," Ken cut in. "She chose not to mention the outcome, only the investigation." The call ended shortly after. I was sitting in the study when Ken finished telling me. The room was quiet, the lamp throwing a narrow pool of light across the desk. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something more like the end of a long drive, the moment you put the car in park and just sit for a second before going inside. Nadine came home that evening at 7. She moved through the kitchen without her usual ease. There was a stiffness in her, a contained quality, like a woman holding something she didn't want to spill. She made dinner without speaking much. I helped without being asked. Over the meal, she looked at me once with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Not anger, not calculation, something that might have been the early edge of fear. "Gerald called me today," she said finally. "I know," I replied. She set her fork down. "You should have told me." I looked at her steadily. "You should have told me," I replied. 4 years ago, when you found the letter, you should have read it all the way through and told me what you found." She opened her mouth, then closed it. "But you didn't," I continued, keeping my voice level. "You read just enough to build something with, and then you used it. In front of our neighbors, our friends, people I've worked with for years. You turned my silence into a story about your sacrifice." I picked up my glass. "That's not a misunderstanding, Nadine. That's a choice." She said nothing for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, wind moved through the yard. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now, Gerald talks to Ken." I told her. "And you listen to what Gerald tells you." I finished my dinner, washed my plate, and went back to the study. Behind me, I heard her sit at the table for a long time without moving. The ground had shifted. She could feel it now. 3 days after the dinner table conversation, I walked into the Asheville Business Coalition's annual November luncheon at the Omni Grove Park in wearing a navy suit and the particular kind of calm that only comes from having nothing left to hide. I hadn't planned to attend. The invitation had been on my desk for 2 weeks, sitting under a folder. But Ken had said it plainly the day before, go. Be visible. Let people see the man, not the story. So I went. The room was full, 120 people, tables of 8, the low roar of professional conversation mixed with the clink of lunch service. I knew perhaps 60 of them, nodded to a dozen on the way to my table, took my seat, ordered water, and let the room come to me. It did. Phil Garrett stopped by between courses. Then Harriet Bloom from the Downtown Development Board. Then a commercial broker named Ted Winslow, who'd sent 2 tenants my way over the years. Each of them engaged with me the way people engage with someone they've been hearing about and are now recalibrating against the original. I was steady. I was specific about my work. I was interested in theirs. By the time the main course arrived, I'd had 5 conversations, none of which had mentioned Nadine, the foundation, or anything adjacent to the narrative she'd been circulating. The conversations were about leases and construction costs in the East Side Development Corridor and whether the city was serious about the riverfront project. Normal things. Real things. The things I'd actually spent 11 years doing while Nadine built a mythology around my supposed fragility. After lunch, Raymond Chu found me near the exit. He was a compact man in his late 60s, quietly put together, with the particular poise of someone who'd spent a long time doing work that mattered without requiring applause for it. He shook my hand with both of his. The spring show is funded, he said. 8 artists confirmed. 2 of them haven't shown publicly before. He held my gaze. I want you to know what that means to them. To me. You earned the support long before I wrote the check, I told him. He nodded slowly. People noticed, that you did it without announcement. In this community that speaks loudly. I thanked him and meant it. On the way out, I passed a table where Dorian Vale was seated with 2 people from Nadine's foundation board. He saw me from across the room and looked away quickly, not rudely, but with the specific avoidance of a man who understands his position has been compromised and hasn't yet figured out what to do about it. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept walking toward the exit with the same unhurried pace I'd carried in. That evening, Olivia Devlin called me. I knew Olivia as Nadine's closest friend in the foundation circle. They'd worked together for years, traveled to art fairs, shared the kind of insider language that signals a tight alliance. I hadn't expected to hear from her. Elliot, she said, sounding careful. I hope I'm not overstepping. Say what you need to say, Olivia. A breath. I've been hearing things for Nadine for years. About your past. About what she said she'd done for you. Another pause. I believed her. I passed some of it along without questioning it. And I'm calling because I think I owe you that acknowledgement. I let the silence sit for a moment. How long have you known the real version? Since Gerald Forsyth called her on Monday, Olivia admitted. She told me about the clearance letter, about the handwriting analysis, about Boyd. Her voice dropped. She told me because she was scared. And in telling me, she told me everything. I thanked her for calling. Before she hung up, she added, whatever she says next, whatever story she lands on, I won't be repeating it. I set the phone down and looked at the ceiling. Nadine had lost her closest ally in the foundation world. Not through pressure, not through legal action, but through the simple, inevitable weight of the truth finally reaching someone who'd been carrying the lie. One by one, the threads were giving way. Curtis called me on a Sunday morning while I was drinking coffee on the back porch. The air was cold, the sky white and flat, the kind of December morning that feels like the world holding its breath. She called me, he said. No greeting, just that. I set the mug down. When? Thursday evening. I didn't pick up. She left a voicemail. A pause. Then she called again Friday. I let that one go to voicemail too. Then she texted. Curtis was 56, a civil engineer based in Knoxville, and the steadiest man I knew outside of a courtroom. He and I had grown up in the same house, learned the same lessons from the same father, and understood each other with the economy of people who don't need to explain their history. Nadine had worked to manage the distance between us the same way she'd managed everything else. Carefully, plausibly, always with a reason that sounded like concern. "What did the voicemail say?" I asked. He pulled out his phone and played on speaker. Nadine's voice came through, warm, practiced, the exact register she used when she wanted something from someone she wasn't sure she had leverage over. "Curtis, it's Nadine. I know we haven't talked in a while, and I'm sorry for that. Elliot's going through something difficult right now, and I'm worried about him. He's been under a lot of pressure, and I think he's making decisions that aren't in his best interest. I just want the people who love him to be aware. I'd really appreciate a call when you have a moment. Just between us." I looked out at the yard. The hedges I'd trimmed in September were bare now, clean-lined against the gray sky. "She's trying to build a new narrative," I said, "before the legal process produces one for her." "I figured," Curtis replied, "which is why I recorded the text exchange when I responded." He paused. I told her I'd call her back. She texted 3 paragraphs. "Elliot," she laid out the whole thing, "said you were unstable, that the legal situation was a reaction to a health scare, that she was trying to protect the estate from decisions you'd make under duress." His voice stayed level. She put in writing. I closed my eyes for a moment. "Send it to Ken." "Already did. 20 minutes ago." "A beat. You doing okay?" "Better than I've been in years," I told him honestly. "Good. Then I'm coming for Christmas." "Non-negotiable." I laughed. A real one, short and quiet. Non-negotiable. After the call, I forwarded Ken's acknowledgement to Nolan. He responded immediately. "She's panicking. Panicking people make mistakes. Let her." He was right. Ken called that afternoon. Forsyth had reached out again, this time with a different tone entirely. The defamation exposure, the falsified document, Boyd Stokes's corroborating records, and now Nadine's own text messages describing Elliot as mentally compromised while simultaneously contesting his legal decisions. The picture was not favorable to her. "Forsyth is advising her to settle," Ken said. "Quietly, quickly, and without litigation." "What are our terms?" I asked. "Clean dissolution. She walks away from the LLC assets, the rental income structure, and any claim to the trust. She retains personal property and the foundation assets she brought into the marriage." He paused. "And a formal non-disclosure. She stops telling the story." "That's acceptable," I said. I thought it would be. That evening I sat in the study for a long time without turning on the lights. The room went dark slowly, the winter evening pulling the last of the light out of the window, and I just sat in the chair and let it happen. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sure I'd been angry in the classical sense at any point. What I'd felt from that Tuesday evening in October when I'd heard her voice in the sunroom was something closer to clarity, the specific relief of a man who finally understands the exact shape of the problem he's been living inside. Nadine had built her power on the assumption that I was too quiet to fight back. She'd confused stillness with surrender. The settlement was signed on a Friday in early January. No courtroom, no confrontation, just 2 attorneys in a conference room and 2 sets of signatures on a document that made everything official. I wasn't present for the signing. Ken handled it. I was at the Merrifield units replacing a water heater with the building maintenance contractor, a job that had been on the schedule for 2 weeks. I got the confirmation text from Ken at 11:47. I read it, sent back a single word, "Good," and went back to the job. Nadine vacated the house by the end of the month. She took her furniture, her art, her carefully curated objects. The rooms looked different without them. Larger, quieter, less decorated. I found I didn't mind. The bones of the house were still good. The structure was mine. The foundation board accepted her resignation without public comment. Olivia told me later, without being asked, that the board had been expecting it. Boyd Stokes sent a brief text the week after. Heard it went through. Good. 2 words that carried more than most speeches. Dorian Vale left Asheville sometime in February. I heard it secondhand from a commercial broker who'd been tracking the gallery lease market. Vale had apparently decided the climate wasn't right for his project. I didn't follow up to find out more. It wasn't my concern. In March, Nolan drove up from Durham for a long weekend. We walked the Merrifield Strip on Saturday morning, talked through a potential expansion on the East Corridor, went to dinner at a place downtown I'd been meaning to try for 2 years. Afterward, sitting at the bar with a drink, he said, "You seem like yourself again." "I am," I told him. "When did you stop being?" he asked, not accusingly, just curious. I thought about it honestly. "Slowly," I said. "The way you stop noticing something that's been changing for years. Then one Tuesday evening you walk past a hallway, and you hear something that makes the whole picture visible all at once." He nodded. "And now I know what I'm building and who I'm building it for," I said. "That's enough to work with." Curtis came for Easter. We grilled on the back porch, watched the game, talked about nothing important for hours. The ordinary ease of two brothers who hadn't needed to fight to stay connected, just to stop letting someone else manage the distance between them. The clearance letter went back into its envelope, back into the bottom drawer of the desk. Not because it no longer mattered, but because it had done its work. It didn't need to sit out in the open anymore. Raymond Chu's spring show opened in April. 8 artists, the 2 newcomers drawing the most attention. He sent me a photograph of the opening night crowd. I put on the bulletin board in the study, next to a lease renewal I was particularly pleased with. Nadine didn't contest anything after the settlement. She landed on her feet. Eventually, new city, new foundation role, new version of herself to present to a room that didn't know the previous one. I didn't track it closely. I had no reason to. What she'd spent years building out of my silence, she'd lost. Not because I destroyed it, but because I'd simply stopped providing the raw material. Some men, when they finally see the shape of what's been done to them, want fire. They want confrontation, public reckoning, the dramatic accounting of every wrong. I understand that impulse. I felt a version of it that Tuesday evening in October, standing at the kitchen sink. But I've been raised by a man who trimmed his own hedges, who believed that what you build with your hands tells the world more about you than anything you say about yourself, who understood that the quietest moves are the ones that last. I'd built something real. She'd borrowed against it without permission. Now the books were balanced, the accounts were clear, and the house, my house, was quiet in the best possible way. That kind of quiet, I'd learned, wasn't emptiness. It was room to start again.
Elliot never raised his voice. He never made a scene. He just quietly removed every single thing she thought she controlled and let the truth do the rest. That's the kind of strength most people never see coming because it doesn't look like strength until it's already won. Thank you for listening today. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.